Dear listeners, we would love to get to know you better. Please write in the comments which country and city you are watching us from. Thank you. The unraveling began weeks before the club confrontation, though I hadn't realized it at the time. Linda had started coming home later than usual, attributing her absences to last-minute work deadlines and spontaneous outings with friends. I believed her at first. After all, she had always been devoted to her career. Yet, the unease grew like a shadow I couldn't shake. One evening, while sorting laundry, I discovered a crumpled receipt in her coat pocket. It was for a lavish dinner at a restaurant we had once promised to visit together. I ignored it, convincing myself it was a business expense or an outing with her colleagues. Still, doubt lingered. Linda's phone habits shifted as well, where once her phone sat openly on the counter, it now rarely left her hand. Notifications were silenced, and when I casually inquired about her messages, she brushed it off with a forced laugh. "Just work stuff," she'd say, evading eye contact. A gnawing suspicion took root, but I couldn't confront her without proof. Our once vibrant weekends turned strained. Linda seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere even during family meals. The kids noticed too. "Why's Mom so quiet lately?" our eldest asked one Sunday. I deflected with reassurances I didn't fully believe myself. The final straw came during a routine grocery trip. I bumped into one of Linda's closest friends who hesitated before greeting me. Her demeanor was stiff, her smile artificial. "Linda's been working so hard lately, hasn't she?" she said, her tone laced with something I couldn't place. It felt like an unspoken warning. That night I waited for Linda to come home, but she never did. Instead, a text arrived at 2 a.m. "Staying with friends, don't wait up." The pit in my stomach became a chasm. Something was undeniably wrong, and I was determined to uncover the truth. It wasn't until I walked into the club and saw Dee that the pieces began to fall into place, revealing a betrayal I had hoped was only in my mind. Turning to the woman who had assisted my wife in her secretive departure, I asked with incredulity, "What is wrong with you? How could you do this?" "Dee, I thought you were someone we could trust." We had often debated the implications of infidelity in marriage, unanimously concluding it was an unpardonable act. Now, witnessing this betrayal firsthand, I could hardly believe it. She shrugged, almost casually. "He's famous," she said, as if that justified it. "You'll get over it." I couldn't hold back. "I always thought you were dim, but I underestimated just how much." I stepped closer, my tone icy. "Do me a favor, don't ever speak to me again. If I'm drowning and you see me, keep walking." She barely reacted. It was clear she was checked out. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was the end of pretense. As I walked away, a huge bouncer blocked my path. "Done for the night." He smirked. "Go back to your table. Drinks are on the house." "How much is he paying you to intervene?" I asked, voice low and dangerous. "Because if you don't move, you'll need every penny." The bouncer faltered but stood firm. "You can't have me," he replied, trying to sound confident. I leaned in closer. "You'd better finish me off if you fight me, because I don't forgive. Maybe I'll hire some guys to make sure you regret it. You'll think twice before stepping outside at night." His confidence crumbled as I brushed past him, my anger unyielding. Near the exit, someone grabbed my arm. I spun, ready to lash out, but stopped when I saw Janie. "Think about your kids," she pleaded. Did she think about them when she left with him? I snapped. "I'll always take care of my kids, but their mother, she's no longer my family." Her eyes filled with hurt, but I didn't care. I turned to leave. Behind me a voice called, "Bob, don't do this." I faced them all, my voice cutting. "I didn't throw anything away," she did. "Look me in the eye and tell me you'd forgive your wife for this." "You can't." I locked eyes with Harry. "Wait, you already know. She's seeing him again, isn't she?" Harry froze while Erica slumped and walked off. The group dissolved into bickering, and I stepped into the elevator without another word. At home I packed quickly, leaving Linda's things untouched. If she wanted them, she could come get them. 30 minutes later, I was in the parking lot when my so-called friends blocked my car. "Move," I said coldly. "Anyone still here, when I start the engine will regret it." Eric stepped forward, trying to speak, but I cut him off with a fist to the gut. None of them were fighters. They didn't know how to defend themselves, but I did. As a teenager, I had a temper and got into fights. Legal trouble and counseling helped me manage my anger. I still lost my temper sometimes, but rarely my control. Tonight, I didn't care. I unlocked my car, started it, and glanced back at them, my gaze cold. Pressing the gas, I screeched out of the lot, forcing them to scatter. I didn't know where I was going. She'd been gone for an hour, probably with him. Part of me wanted to find them and end it violently, but I knew that wasn't realistic. He was a pro football star with millions and a fortress for a house. I was just an average guy with rage, and rage wasn't enough. At a stoplight, an idea hit me. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I pulled into a diner with free Wi-Fi and called my niece, offering her $500 for help. She agreed immediately. Minutes later, she arrived with her friend Eric. Inside, I rented the diner's privacy by paying the waitress $400 to close early. Then I explained everything. My wife leaving with a pro athlete, her friends covering for her, and my need for justice. My niece, Nanette, was furious. "Your wife left you for a jog and her friends helped. What kind of people are these?" She snapped. "They're her friends from school," I replied. "She's changed, not me. Now let me tell you my plan, and you tell me how bad it is." Nanette grinned. "Eric, get the black box." The black box was a modified, untraceable laptop. Nanette assured me it was safe. Within minutes, she hacked into my wife's social media accounts. "Ready?" she asked. "Let's make this ugly." Eric hesitated. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "There's no coming back from this betrayal." Nanette began typing as if she were my wife, crafting posts full of scandalous and incriminating details. She bragged about joining the celebrity club and shared crude, suggestive comments about the football player. She even thanked her friend Dee for distracting me, hinting at prior infidelities during a girls' weekend. Nanette added fake replies from her friends, cheering her on and making jokes about their own exploits. The posts were brutal, leaving no room for doubt about their betrayal. When she finished, Nanette turned to me. "It's done. Your wife's social life is officially a nuclear wasteland." I nodded, the weight of the night settling in. There was no turning back now. Nanette found some pictures of the idiot and Linda, then posted them online. By midnight, notifications were pouring in, and I could imagine her social circle buzzing with calls despite the late hour. Nanette didn't stop there. She lit up Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. I wasn't worried about Linda noticing. She likely had her phone off. Comments came fast. "Is this a joke? I bet your husband doesn't think it's funny. What's wrong with you?" Even her favorite aunt chimed in, apparently awake at this hour. Nanette replied as Linda, "Not a joke. I saw an opportunity and took it. How many can say they've slept with someone famous? Don't believe me? Swing by 130 Wyndham Circle tomorrow around 10 a.m. You can catch my walk of shame or fame." More comments flooded in, some from unfamiliar names. One said, "You're proud of this. Do you really think your marriage can survive?" Linda responded, "I love my husband. He's the best thing that ever happened to me. And he'll forgive me. It's just one night. I'll never do it again." Another retorted, "If you never plan to do it once, what makes you think you won't repeat it? I'm done with you. Don't contact me." That one hit hard. It was from her boss's wife. Nanette grinned and posted everything to Linda's company page. Monday was going to be interesting. Other responses were just as scathing. "This isn't funny." Linda replied again, "Every word is true. We'll be fine. I have faith in my husband. A commenter shot back, "Faith, you've destroyed any reason he had to trust you. This is beyond stupid." Her cousin chimed in, "I'm done with you. Don't try to reply. You're blocked." Nanette hesitated. She always liked Linda. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" "Not yet. I've got more to do." Nanette ramped up the chaos, posting to the football team's website, the NFL office, charities, and city officials. Then she hacked the guy's accounts. His public image was spotless, a charitable athlete adored by his community. It was time to change that. Eric found a sports writer who despised him. Using a voice scrambler, I called the writer and spilled the story. Mark had knowingly taken a married woman from a club, leaving her husband behind. I even told him to check with the bouncer. The writer, eager for a story during the off-season, ran with it. Meanwhile, Nanette sent the details to local TV stations and newspapers. By morning, reporters and paparazzi swarmed Mark's gated neighborhood. At 8 a.m., someone from the team pounded on his door. He answered in a robe with Linda visible behind him, also robed. Cameras clicked furiously. His shocked expression and Linda's presence told the whole story. He slammed the door, but the damage was done. Inside, Linda realized her accounts were locked. Her scream, raw and furious, echoed from the mansion. The fallout had begun. Nanette later counted over 3,000 comments across platforms in just 6 hours. Linda had never been so infamous. At 10 a.m., she left the house, head covered but still recognizable. The paparazzi caught her leaving in Mark's car, snapping clear photos as they exited the driveway. This wasn't their first time dodging cameras, but the paparazzi were ready. Mark drove her home where reporters swarmed her house. As she ran to the door, questions flew. "Are you his girlfriend now? Did you leave your husband? Did he approve of this?" Her family saw everything online. Both moms, being Facebook friends, were horrified. I took our kids to my parents' house, where her parents also showed up. Meanwhile, 4 cars camped outside her house. The fallout wasn't letting up. I rented a hotel room for a few days to clear my head. The receptionists seemed amused, likely recognizing my name from the scandal. Running into old friends at the hotel was surreal. Fueled by adrenaline and anger after 30 sleepless hours, I confronted one of Linda's friends, Dee. "You've hurt Linda for nothing." She said, "It was just a fantasy." "No," I replied. "She broke our marriage beyond repair. It's not worth fixing." When Dee mentioned Linda's past flirtation with a hockey player, her husband lunged at me. I backed back and made it clear on camera that I was defending myself. Then I turned to the group. "You all helped ruin my life. I hope yours implode too." I never returned to our home. Linda didn't understand at first, insisting it wasn't a big deal. "Sure, I spent the night with someone else. But it's over. Can't we move on?" She even downplayed it as a dream come true, recalling her admiration for Mark from his Chicago days. When I filed for divorce, citing infidelity, her attitude shifted to anger and desperation. She tried threats and appeals, but I refused to budge. The scandal nearly cost her job, and her boss's wife barely tolerated her presence. The media frenzy escalated when the paparazzi bribed the club's bouncer, who revealed that Mark had a history of similar incidents. He wasn't just a party boy. He was a habitual homewrecker. Mark probably regretted not signing with a different team after leaving Chicago. As a Panthers player in North Carolina, an alienation of attachment state, he should have lived outside the state line. My lawyer advised against pursuing him until my divorce was finalized, but Mark, his team, and the NFL immediately went into damage control. One evening, I opened my apartment door to a man holding a briefcase. "Sir, I'd like to talk to." "Leave," I said, slamming the door and locking it. He pounded so hard that I called the police, who escorted him away. Before leaving, he glared at my security camera and shook his fist. Soon after, I got a call from the team's new owner. "How did you get my number?" I asked. He sighed. "Does it matter?" I hung up, changed my number, and repeated this routine for 8 days. Then another caller identified himself as a representative of the children's charity Go Deep. I don't have funds for another charity, I told him. I'm not asking for a donation, he responded. We want to offer you money. Why? I asked, confused. The charity's founder is Mark Lee, he explained. Instead saying another word, I hung up again and blocked the number. Soon, I started receiving emails blaming me for the charity's decline. When I finally decided to return the call, they immediately accused me of tarnishing Mark's reputation. Let me be clear, I said, my voice steady. This man seduced my wife right in front of me. With dozens of witnesses, she stayed overnight. Whether or not she admits it, we know what happened. If he publicly confesses, I might consider talking. That wouldn't be wise, the caller warned. Why don't you just let this go? No, I replied firmly. Tell Mark to invent time travel, undo what he did, and then we'll talk. Otherwise, things are about to get much worse. Don't contact me again. Later, I vented to Eric and Nanette about my frustration with cell phones, which sparked an idea. They developed an app that mimicked the sound of slamming a phone receiver. It sold 50,000 downloads in 2 months, earning enough for me to buy a house. The kids loved it, but leaving them for good broke my heart. Linda was delusional, insisting it was just one night. One night too many, I replied. You planned this with your friends, so I wouldn't stop you. You stole our future that night. Mark doesn't care he ruined a family. My rare outburst startled her. Maybe she thought I was weak, because I never raised my voice before. The kids struggled with the separation, so I sent them to therapy. The therapist carefully explained that their mother had made a serious mistake and was facing the consequences. The therapist invited us to separate sessions and provided me with summaries since I was paying. Linda continued denying her guilt and told the kids her actions weren't serious enough to justify divorce. When our daughter asked what she had done, Linda said it was an adult issue she'd understand when she was older. Our 4-year-old son, who picks up a lot from the media, asked questions too, but Linda only admitted to making a mistake and said she was trying to fix it. He didn't seem convinced and harbored resentment toward her. In my session, I answered honestly, yes, son, I'm divorcing your mother because she broke a commitment. Promises, especially those made in front of others and bound legally and spiritually, matter. When someone breaks that trust, it's hard to rebuild. Imagine I promised to pick you up every Wednesday but left you waiting one day because I chose to do something else. How many times would you believe me before deciding you couldn't trust me? I followed the therapist's advice, refraining from criticizing Linda, and assured them that despite the divorce, we both loved them deeply. Linda, however, undermined this by telling the kids that I was being stubborn and that the divorce was unnecessary. The therapist, frustrated, confronted her saying, "Your children already understand that your relationship with your husband is over. You need to accept responsibility for your actions and move on. I recommend counseling for you to process this, but I will no longer work with you." This only prompted Linda to pursue counseling, which the judge mandated for 8 sessions. The therapist had the option to halt sessions after 4 if no progress was made. During the hearing, I addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'll attend these sessions as required, but I refuse to go beyond 8. I have no interest in reconciling with my wife beyond co-parenting. If necessary, I'm prepared to face fines or jail. Also, I request that her lover attend 1 session to explain why he believes it's acceptable to sleep with married women and how that shouldn't impact a marriage. Thank you." My lawyer looked shocked. The judge seemed torn between laughing and reprimanding me, and Linda appeared on the verge of getting sick. Her lawyer looked desperate for something to object to. After banging his gavel twice, the judge spoke. "I can't mandate someone to marriage counseling for a marriage they're not in. I'll draft a letter for consideration, but don't expect much. Your attorney can legally subpoena him to court if you want, but that's your call. Counselors, submit a list of therapists or get one from the court. Sessions must start in 2 weeks, twice a week to finish quickly. If a session is missed, it will count as valid, and no rescheduling will be allowed. Ordered. Next case. Linda wasn't happy. She confronted me by the car, her expression determined. This needs to stop. It's not what I wanted. I hesitated for a moment, but asked, what did you expect? I thought you'd be mad, but love me enough to move past it. It was just one night. That's not worth throwing everything away. Our years together, our family, our kids. I snapped. It wasn't just one night. It's every night after that. You humiliated me in front of friends, some of whom even helped you sneak away like a thief. Before, I would have bet my life you loved me and our kids. Not anymore. We're done. No amount of counseling will fix this. See you at the first session. She paused, then said, wait, I need a favor. A favor? Really? It's about Mark. Could you cut him some slack? His charity work is suffering. Think of the children. I retorted. Like you two thought about ours that night. I don't care about his charities. Soon that'll be the least of his problems. How do you know that? She asked, her voice hesitant. She lowered her eyes. He called me. How did he get your number? I demanded. Your face turned red. I realized you gave it to him that night, didn't you? Hoping for a repeat performance. She stammered. I don't know why I gave it to him. I just did. I laughed and got in the car, amazed at her audacity. Meanwhile, the pressure on me to back down increased. The league, the team, charities and sports shows all urged me to drop it. Even my boss, a team fan, leaned on me. I responded by finding another job. When my boss realized how this would look publicly, he tried to backtrack. It was too late, especially after I filed an HR complaint. I had a feeling his career was over. I started documenting every conversation, keeping them short and to the point. A sports announcer invited me on his top-rated radio show, where I shared bombshells from these discussions. One about a team owner went viral. The owner called, furious, and threatened to sue. The host barely held back laughter. My guest is nodding. Do you have a response? I grinned. What are you suing me for? Telling the truth. In this state, one-party consent makes it legal to record conversations. I won't use this legally unless you force me to. My lawyer says we have grounds to accuse your team and the league of maltreatment and mental anguish. The owner hung up. The clip went national, and I didn't hear from them again. As for Mark, the press ignored him unless it was about the divorce. Once treated like a hero, he grew frustrated. Despite his lawyer's warnings, he snapped and made a major mistake. He showed up at my house. The first thing I did after moving into my new home was install a top-of-the-line security system. Ironically, it was the same system he had endorsed in his company's commercials. He wasn't wrong. It was worth every penny. One night, there was a knock at the door. When I checked the doorbell camera on my phone, I saw 3 large men standing on my porch. They didn't look friendly at all. My kids were with me, so I hit the silent alarm, which immediately notified the police. Within seconds, they called. Is this an emergency? Yes, I replied quickly. There are 3 large men on my porch. I don't know them, and they don't look happy. I haven't opened the door, but now they're pounding on it, demanding I let them in. Sir, stay inside, and do not open the door. Officers are 4 minutes away. I thanked them and waited, counting down every second. When 3.5 minutes had passed, I cracked the door open, just slightly, making sure the storm door was securely locked. What do you want? I asked. Mark sent us, one of the men said. Stop all the legal action against him immediately. And if I don't, I asked, my voice steady. Then we'll teach you a lesson about cooperation, he warned. You're trespassing. Leave my property now, I said firmly. The biggest of the 3 sighed and shook his head. Looks like he needs some convincing, he muttered. Before I could react, he ripped the storm door off its hinges, as if it were made of cardboard. Just as they prepared to force their way inside, a commanding voice boomed from behind them. Please stop and put your hands up. The men froze. Their glares could have melted steel, but their fight was over. The leader looked like he wanted to resist, but his friends convinced him otherwise. Moments later, all three were face down in handcuffs. The officers took my statement and reviewed the security footage. They charged the men with trespassing and more. I later learned that premeditated trespassing with harmful intent carries much steeper penalties than ordinary trespassing. It turned out one of the men worked at a stadium, another was a friend, and the third was a practice squad player who was promptly dismissed. Apparently Mark had promised him a permanent spot on the team for his help, even though he had no authority to make such a promise. The other two were paid $1,000 each. In the end, Mark's plan cost him far more. Legal fees alone were staggering. All three men pleaded guilty, racking up hefty fines that Mark ended up covering. Forced for him, he had to appear in court for orchestrating the scheme. His legal team managed to downgrade the charges to a misdemeanor, but he still faced a $5,000 fine and 200 hours of community service. TMZ caught footage of him in an orange vest picking up trash along the highway, and the clip went viral, racking up 600,000 views in a week. Linda was becoming the most expensive woman he'd ever pursued. His once adoring fans began to turn on him. Some brought signs to games mocking him, including one that read, "Put someone's wife on the goal line. That'll get his attention." Although stadium security confiscated it, the image hit social media and amassed nearly 1 million views in just 2 days. Mark's performance on the field suffered. Sponsors backed away and he'd lost a major campaign indefinitely, likely forever. Then, karma hit me hard. One night 4 men ambushed me out of nowhere. They didn't waste time breaking 2 fingers, my leg, a cheekbone, and cracking several ribs, all within 90 seconds. They were efficient. It could have been worse, but a coworker exited the office and yelled, startling them. They fled immediately. 10 minutes later, I was in an ambulance. An hour after that, I was in a hospital room with a concussion, slipping in and out of consciousness. At one point, I thought I saw Linda sitting by my bed, but when I woke up again, she was gone. It took me a week to recover enough to return to work. The police obtained security footage from nearby businesses, but the attackers had carefully avoided cameras. They wore hats and baggy clothing to hide any identifiable features. An officer reviewing the footage said, "If someone has a grudge against you, let us know." I told them everything. They questioned Mark, who reportedly laughed and admitted he didn't like me, but denied any involvement. The police didn't believe him, but lacked evidence to prove otherwise. I had to give up spending weekends with my kids. I wasn't in good shape physically or emotionally, and I didn't want them to see me covered in bruises. Linda was appalled by what had happened and offered to come over to help, but I declined. The counseling sessions dragged on, repetitive and unproductive. After 4 sessions, even the therapist seemed to lose patience. By the 5th session, she told us not to interrupt her while she spoke. "We've reached a deadlock," she began, her tone firm. "Honestly, I don't think you'll move past this. Linda, you refuse to acknowledge that your actions were wrong by any standard, and you seem to think that shouldn't impact your marriage. Do I?" Linda shot back, her voice sharp. "Yes," the therapist continued. "You left your husband standing in a club without a word and spent the night with another man. You used your friends to keep him from stopping you. Let me ask you this. If he had done the same to you, left you stranded in public while your so-called friends helped him deceive you, would you have been sympathetic, based on your behavior here?" I doubt it. She raised a hand before Linda could respond. "Don't speak yet. Think about it while I talk to your husband." Turning to me, her expression softened, tinged with sadness. "You're not going to win her back. That much is clear. From what I've observed, it's obvious." I nodded slightly, already knowing where this was headed. "Let me ask you something," she said, addressing me now. "Up until the moment she walked out of that club with another man, you loved her. She was faithful for years, and she insists it was a one-time mistake, something she can't even explain herself. She swears it's over and will never happen again. Is there any part of you willing to try again? I'll let Linda speak first. Don't interrupt. You'll get your turn. The therapist gestured for Linda to speak. After a brief pause, Linda began. You've said I show little remorse, but that's not true. Linda said, her voice softening. I have a lot of remorse. I never imagined my actions would hurt our marriage this deeply. I knew you'd be angry, but I didn't think it would lead to divorce. I regret everything, and I promise I'll never do anything like that again. I understand the cost now, and I want to make it right. Even if you can't fully forgive me, please come home so we can fix this. She finished, her eyes pleading with me. I looked at her, my voice steady. You can say whatever you want, Linda. But deep down you knew how much your actions would hurt. You knew I wasn't the kind of man who would just shrug it off and say, it was a mistake. Let's move on. If I did, you'd lose respect for me. Maybe you wouldn't actively seek out another opportunity, but if one came along, you'd take it knowing I forgive you. I'm not going to let that happen. This marriage is over. I'm divorcing you. You can drag this out as much as you want, but eventually the court will grant it. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I turned to the counselor. Are we done? She sighed. Yes, I'll submit my report to the court by Wednesday, stating the marriage is irreparably broken and recommending the divorce. Linda's response was immediate. No, I'm not giving up. Think of the children. I think about the kids every single day, I said sharply. I don't have them. Tell me, Linda, when you were with him in his mansion, how often did you think about our kids? Was it worth it to you? Because for the rest of us, it wasn't. Face it, Linda. You made a colossal mistake. See you in court. By the end of the proceedings, everyone was exhausted. Linda's lawyer looked worn out. My lawyer was equally drained. The judge, clearly fed up, ended another stalling attempt and declared the divorce final. Linda left without a word, and my lawyer flashed a triumphant grin. The next day, we filed a lawsuit against Mark for alienation of affection. He wasn't required to sign with the Panthers or buy a home in North Carolina, but his outrage when he found out was legendary. His lawyer groaned, "He can't do this." "Unfortunately, he can," someone replied. "It's still legal here." Yes, it's an outdated law that should have been repealed years ago, but it wasn't. Mark's advisors urged him to settle quickly to avoid further damage to his reputation, but I refused every offer. I didn't care about the money. I wanted to drag his name through the mud. The investigators we hired uncovered evidence. A bouncer and a team leader admitted to being paid by Mark to help facilitate his actions. Mark tried to dodge court appearances, even citing football obligations, but the judge wasn't impressed. "Take a later flight," the judge said. "Be here tomorrow." Mark's charm didn't sway the jury. While his lawyers tried to stack the panel with sympathetic jurors, my lawyer outmaneuvered them. By the end, Mark's lies unraveled. First, he denied knowing Linda. Then, when confronted with evidence, he admitted she had been in his house but claimed nothing happened. His defense fell apart, and the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Linda decided to write me a letter, believing it might help me better understand her perspective. Since the letter was addressed to me and in my possession, we used it as evidence in court. Her claim of an abusive relationship with her lover didn't hold up, and her court testimony sealed the deal. She revealed everything, even the number of times she'd been with him. While her letter suggested 3 or 4 encounters, the reality was 5. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision. Part of the trial involved full financial disclosure, and the courtroom was stunned when it was revealed that Mark, a former NFL player with a 7-year career, had amassed $96 million. My lawyer nearly fainted when I was awarded roughly a third of that, $30 million. It was the largest settlement in the state's history, far surpassing the previous high of $8.8 million. Although the law allowing such awards had been amended, it still permitted up to 1/3 of the defendant's assets to be claimed in cases like this. When this law was enacted, no one envisioned it applying to someone with such a fortune. Efforts to repeal it had stalled in the state legislature, leaving the provision intact. Mark's lawyers initially filed an appeal but quickly dropped it, realizing a loophole could increase the payout if his wealth grew during the appeal process. He begrudgingly accepted the court's decision. Around the same time, Mark had a massive contract payment on the horizon. Adding insult to injury, my attorney served him with 4 additional lawsuits from others claiming he had interfered in their marriages. These included 2 divorced individuals, a couple with a strained marriage, and a pair who claimed he had crossed a line. Linda also filed her own lawsuit as part of this wave. While some cases were quickly settled, resulting in payouts of $4 million each, Mark still retained tens of millions. But the revelations didn't end there. Investigators discovered he had an affair with a teammate's wife and a one-night stand with another. During a subsequent game, it was clear his teammates weren't thrilled. Miscommunications on the field led to him taking 3 brutal hits, the last of which sidelined him with a concussion. The Panthers decided they couldn't justify keeping him, citing a morality clause in his contract. Mark was traded to Green Bay, where his performance was decent but unremarkable. He had to settle for 20% of what his original contract promised. After a year in Green Bay, he signed with Denver for $4 million, but again couldn't command a long-term deal. Eventually, he joined Cincinnati on a 2-year contract worth $2.5 million. This deal included strict morality clauses, ensuring he would forfeit all earnings if caught in compromising situations. Mark's gameplay remained competent. It was far from his peak, and the team declined to renew his contract when it expired. By then, at 34, he was battered and plagued by injuries, leading him to retire. Post-retirement, Mark hosted a radio show for 2 years with the Bengals before fading into obscurity. Despite his troubles, he still had about $50 million left, a far cry from the fortune he could have had without lawsuits and bad publicity. When last heard of, he had bought 2 car dealerships in California and reportedly returned to his old habits. One of his escapades ended with a confrontation that left him walking with a limp. It seemed he hadn't learned much. I came across an article about him in a sports magazine. It was part of a Where Are They Now feature, showing him at the grand opening of his 3rd dealership. He'd gained weight and shaved his head, likely due to balding. Despite everything, his remaining millions in past glory probably still made him attractive to some. I briefly considered sending the article to Linda. Speaking of Linda, she received half of our savings and was allowed to keep the house until our youngest child turned 18. At that point, she could either buy me out, or we would sell the property and split the proceeds. She also got child support based on my former salary. They were still my kids, and I made sure they had everything they needed. I even bought her a new SUV to replace her totaled car, ensuring the kids had safe, reliable transportation. I sometimes wondered if Linda resented the fact that I had millions while she didn't have access to any of it. She wasn't completely without resources, though. She eventually received a settlement from her lover in a share of an app we had developed together during our marriage. The app became popular for a while, especially with its voice feature, which allowed users to send phrases like, "Go to hell," and "Don't ever call me again" for a small fee. The app brought her about $30,000 annually for 3 years before its popularity waned. I put my share into the kids' college fund, adding to it every time the app earned money. Years later, I calculated how much the lawsuits, bad publicity, and contract losses had cost Mark, somewhere between $110 and $170 million. Linda's choices had made her part of one of the most expensive divorces in history. Everyone leaves their mark, I suppose. Dee got divorced less than a year after me, and Janie and her husband separated about 18 months later. The couples where the wife had already cheated ended things before my own divorce was finalized. As far as I know, the others stayed together, but I didn't care. After that last morning, I never spoke to any of them again. Over the next 6 years, I occasionally found myself waking up and instinctively reaching for Linda. These moments usually followed dreams about how things had been between us before everything fell apart. I never remarried. I started dating again but remained cautious, still a bit shy around women. It didn't take long to realize that many of them were more interested in my money than me, which made me even more guarded. Both of my kids became passionate about soccer. My son played mostly for fun in the camaraderie, but my daughter was serious about it and showed real talent. Her best friend, who was slightly better than her, often stayed over, which meant I got to know her and her mom, Scarlett. Scarlett was struggling, emotionally drained from dealing with her toxic ex, and financially strained because he vanished without paying child support. Her daughter let it slip that they were barely making ends meet. Quietly, I tracked down Scarlett's ex and had him arrested for failing to pay support. The man had a solid job, so the judge ordered him to pay off the overdue amount within 2 years or face jail time. This doubled Scarlett's monthly payments and gave her some breathing room, though I never told her I was behind it. The change in Scarlett was remarkable. She began smiling more, carried herself with confidence, and even revamped her wardrobe. She started catching the attention of other men, especially when she wore athletic shorts to soccer games. By then, she and I had become close. I acted as her shield from unwelcome advances, and the girls loved to tease us by playing matchmaker. Somewhere along the way, holding hands at games and events became second nature, and Scarlett and her daughter were spending most nights at my house, her in the guest room, and the girls sharing a room. Thanks to my financial stability, I had purchased a stunning property, 40 acres of rolling hills with a pond, a 10-acre pasture, and a barn with 6 stalls. The previous owners had been horse enthusiasts, and soon enough the barn was filled with horses. While I was hesitant at first, horses seemed enormous and intimidating. Scarlett, who had grown up with them, found my apprehension amusing. After a few months of resistance, I caved and told Scarlett to pick out horses for the kids and herself. I promised to cover all expenses as long as she taught the kids to ride and care for them. "I'll foot the bill," I added, "but I'm not shoveling manure." Scarlett stood firm, insisting that the kids had to handle their responsibilities or the horses would go. Before I realized it, Scarlett and I were making decisions about the kids together, and I found myself following her lead. That Christmas, she surprised me with a horse of my own, a big mischievous Pindo. She convinced me to start riding with them, even resorting to playful threats of spending less time with me. The kids were so alarmed by the idea that I gave in. The bond between Scarlett and the kids grew stronger. My son, who had struggled emotionally after the divorce, found comfort in her presence, and the girls confided all their fears and secrets to her. Over time, I not only learned to ride but also found myself shoveling manure for the compost Scarlett used in her vegetable garden. Somehow Scarlett roped me into helping her expand the garden, though I couldn't resist laughing when she struggled with the cultivator. She didn't appreciate my amusement, but I ended up finishing the tilling for her. The kids pitched in too, after Scarlett told them they wouldn't get to eat anything from the garden if they didn't help. One day, after dropping the girls off at soccer camp, I asked Scarlett if she ever thought about dating again. Her face flushed, and she gave me a look that said I was clueless. Then she laughed. "I am dating. He's a nice guy, though he's pretty oblivious most of the time." A wave of jealousy hit me, but she smiled and clarified. "I'm dating you, silly. How many times have we gone out to dinner, seen movies, or taken the kids on outings? We're practically living at your place, 5 days a week. It's not just family stuff." She continued, "Your kids already call me mom when you're not around. Kelsey's even planning to take you to Father-Daughter Day at her new school. It's a good thing she switched schools, otherwise we have a scheduling mess." Holding my hand, she added, "I've been in love with you for a long time. I know you've been hurt, but when was the last time you were with someone else? You can't remember, can you? Maybe because you've had feelings for someone, but we're afraid to admit it. Well, that ends today. If you want me, turn right and take us home. If not, turn left and drop me at my apartment." We were at an intersection, and I jokingly fiddled with the turn signal. "Looks like the left turn signal's broken," I said with a grin. Scarlett smiled brightly. "Then I'd better turn right, but brace yourself. There's going to be a collision. A big one. Let's go home." Later that evening, she reassured me. "I know what happened with your ex-wife, and I want you to know I'd never betray your trust. When I'm committed, I'm all in. I promise you that." Eventually, she offered to sign a prenup, but after I snapped at the suggestion, she just chuckled and never mentioned it again. Linda struggled for a while after everything went public. The fallout from her affair with me and the alienation of affection lawsuit that dominated the headlines for weeks clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. She left her job claiming the emotional baggage was too much to bear. Financially, she was stable thanks to the generous divorce settlement she received from me. So she took nearly a year off before working again. Eventually, she joined a fledgling company, did her homework, and invested $1 million in the startup, acquiring a 10% stake. Within a year, she was promoted as the business began to grow. Out of curiosity, I decided to look into the company. They had a solid product and a smart business model, but they were clearly underfunded. After consulting with my investment team, I discreetly put $5 million into the company under our children's names when they went public, giving Linda the voting proxies. Despite her betrayal, I trusted her to always prioritize our kids' best interests. With the investment, she became the controlling partner. When the company restructured, Linda was promoted to vice president of sales and production. She threw herself into the role, working more than 50 hours a week, but she seemed energized by it. Meanwhile, the kids spent most of their time at my house, doting on their little brother. Scarlett, who was 6 years younger than me, had made it clear before we married that she wanted at least one child. Daniel Brock, named after her grandfather, was now nearly 2 years old. I was relieved the older kids adored him, as it gave Scarlett some much-needed breaks. At my urging, Scarlett left her career to focus on being a stay-at-home mom, a full-time job with 3 teenagers and a toddler to manage. Despite my busy life, I still had sleepless nights. Sometimes I'd lie awake, thinking about where my life might have gone if Linda hadn't cheated. I noticed something curious during these nights. If I got up for a drink or to use the bathroom, Scarlett would toss and turn in bed. But the moment I returned and placed a hand on her, she'd drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. I began to realize how much she relied on physical closeness for comfort. When we walked or went shopping, her hand naturally found mine, as if it was second nature, except when one of us was off wrangling the kids. Then, as soon as she could, her hand would be back in mine. Thinking back, I recalled how Linda used to keep as much distance as possible in bed, often claiming she was too hot to sleep near me. That contrast struck me again at our son's high school graduation. Scarlett had stepped away to take photos with his friends, and Linda's new husband tagged along, as their son and ours had become close. Their connection reminded me of how Scarlett and I had started. Linda and I had been divorced for over a decade, and she'd been remarried for 3 years. While she and her new husband seemed happy, she approached me during the ceremony, her eyes heavy with sadness. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked quietly. "Of course," I replied. "What's on your mind?" "I owe you something," she began. "It's long overdue. 12 years, in fact." "I need to apologize," she sighed. "It took me 4 years and a lot of therapy to really understand the pain I caused you. I'm so sorry. To this day, I can't explain why I did what I did or why I thought it would be okay. For years, I was so angry at you for divorcing me that I couldn't think clearly. In my twisted logic, sleeping with someone famous felt like a harmless thrill, something you should have been proud of, not upset about." She smiled ruefully, adding, "I know how ridiculous that sounds now." Linda continued, "It wasn't until 2 years into therapy that my counselor asked me an important question. Who was on your celebrity list? Remember that silly game we used to play about which famous person we'd hook up with if we had the chance?" I chuckled, Anne Hathaway still got a soft spot for her. Linda grinned. Well, my therapist told me to imagine you actually following through on it. At some glamorous event, leaving me behind to spend the night with her, then coming back as if nothing happened. She asked me to imagine how I'd feel if the whole world knew about it too. At first I laughed and said he'd never do that to me. But then I let myself really think about it, and I got furious, like absolutely livid. That was my breakthrough moment. I realized that my anger in that hypothetical situation was the exact pain I inflicted on you in real life, and I knew nothing could ever erase that. She looked at me, her voice steady, but tinged with regret. So here it is, I was wrong. You had every right to end our marriage. If the roles were reversed, I'd never have trusted you again, no matter how much you apologized. If I could go back, I'd laugh in that guy's face when he asked me to dance. Her sincerity took me by surprise. Thank you, Linda, I said after a moment. Doing this now, it helps in a way. As I walked away, her words stayed with me. Life doesn't give us do-overs. Burnt bridges are hard to rebuild, and the water that's flowed beneath them isn't coming back. I had a lot with Linda, but with Scarlett, I found everything I could ever need. After everything had settled, the court battles, the media frenzy, the emotional turmoil, life took on a strange calm. It was as if I had been living in the eye of a hurricane, and now the storm had passed, leaving a quiet but oddly unsettling stillness. I looked around at the life I had rebuilt, piecing together the remnants of what once was and forging something entirely new. The house echoed with laughter from the kids and Scarlett's gentle voice calling everyone to dinner. But there were moments, especially late at night, when the quiet became a mirror, reflecting back all the pain and growth I had endured. I often found myself in the barn, rushing the horses long after the kids had gone to bed. There was something therapeutic about the rhythmic motion, the way the animal's steady presence grounded me. Scarlett would sometimes join me, her laughter soft in the dim light as she teased me about my growing fondness for the creatures I once feared. You're unnatural, she'd say, her eyes sparkling. Who would have thought? As the years went on, the scars of the past began to fade, though they never disappeared entirely. Linda and I had managed to find a fragile peace, mainly for the sake of the kids. She had remarried, and while I could see she was happy in her way, there was always a trace of regret in her eyes when we crossed paths at family events. It wasn't malicious or bitter, it was simply a quiet acknowledgement of what could have been. Scarlett, on the other hand, was a constant reminder that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. She had brought so much light into our lives, not just for me, but for the kids as well. My daughter often said Scarlett was her role model, someone who balanced strength and kindness with grace. Watching them together filled me with a sense of gratitude I couldn't put into words. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the rolling hills, Scarlett turned to me, her expression serious. "Do you ever think about forgiveness?" she asked. I hesitated. "For Linda?" She nodded. "Not for her sake, but for yours. Carrying anger and resentments, it can be heavy." I leaned back in my chair considering her words. Scarlett had a way of seeing through the walls I built, gently nudging me toward truths I wasn't always ready to face. "I've thought about it," I admitted. "I don't think I'm there yet. Maybe someday." She smiled softly, taking my hand. "Someday is enough. Just don't let it consume you. You've built something beautiful here. Don't let the past steal it from you." Scarlett's words stayed with me, and over time I found myself letting go of the bitterness, little by little. It wasn't a grand cathartic moment, just a gradual easing of the weight I had carried for so long. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about condoning what had happened. It was about freeing myself from the hold it had over me. Linda and I eventually had a conversation that was long overdue. It wasn't planned. It just happened one afternoon when she came by to pick up the kids. We stood in the kitchen, awkward at first, until she broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice tentative, "I've been meaning to thank you for everything you've done for the kids, and even for me. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I looked at her, seeing a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. I did it for them, I said simply. But I'm glad you're doing well. We all make mistakes, Linda. It's what we do after that defines us. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I know, I replied. And in that moment I meant it. The anger and pain that had defined our interactions for years were gone, replaced by a quiet acceptance. We would never be what we once were, but maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to coexist peacefully. Life, I've learned, is a series of endings and beginnings. Some doors close, others open. And sometimes you find yourself standing in the threshold, unsure of which way to go. But if there's one thing I've come to understand, it's that every ending, no matter how painful, holds the promise of a new beginning. And as I sat on that porch with Scarlett, her hand in mine, and the sound of laughter echoing from the barn, I knew I had found mine. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.